In this video, I'm going to show you how I work the Irish mesh stitch featured in my Cruel Summer cardigan. I'm using Barocco's Chai yarn, a linen silk blend, which is the yarn I used for this design. If you've never knit with a linen yarn before, it could take a little getting used to, so I thought it might be helpful to show you how I work this stitch pattern using this yarn. As I demo the stitch pattern, I'm going to be slipping the first stitch on every row, since that is what I did in this design. So the actual stitch pattern is worked in between these edge stitches. So let's get started. So in row 1 of the pattern, I first slipped the first stitch purlwise with yarn and back. So holding the yarn behind the right needle, I'm going to insert the right needle into the first stitch as if to purl, just like this. And then I'm just going to slide it onto the right needle without working it. Then I make sure to give the yarn a nice tug. Then the pattern says to knit 2. Now, one thing I want to stress is, especially with this yarn, when you go to knit that first stitch, make sure to knit it as tightly as possible. So I kind of give the yarn a tug, and then when I knit that first stitch, I give it another extra tug. This is because a linen yarn like this, it doesn't have much elasticity to it. So when working a slip stitch edging, you need to try to work the stitches next to the slip stitch tightly just to help keep that edging nice and neat. Okay, so then I just have one more stitch to knit since it said to knit 2 after that first slip stitch. Then it says to yarn over. So you're going to bring the yarn to the front of the work in between the 2 needle tips and then back over the top of the right needle, just like that. Then you slip 1 by inserting the right needle into the next stitch on the left needle purlwise, and then just sliding it onto the right needle without working it. Then it says to knit 2. So I'm going to go ahead and just knit the next 2 stitches. And then it says to PSSO, which stands for Pass, Slip, Stitch Over. To do this, you're going to insert your left needle into the 3rd stitch in on the right needle, because that was the stitch that we had slipped. So you're going to insert it into that stitch just like this. Now, because this is a linen yarn, it could be a little splitty. So it's really important that you pay attention when you go into this stitch, that you go into all the strands of it. Then you're going to lift it up and over the 2 stitches that you had just knit and off of the right needle, just like that. Because those instructions were in brackets, that means it's a sequence that's repeated over and over again until you're instructed to stop. In this case, the pattern says to work the bracket sequence to 2 stitches before the end. So let's do a couple more together. So we're going to yarn over, then slip 1, then knit 2, and then we're going to pass that slip stitch over. So we're going to insert the left needle into this slip stitch. So that was the 3rd stitch in on the right needle. And we're going to lift it up and over those 2 stitches we just knit and off of the right needle. So then yarn over, slip 1, knit 2, and then pass the slip stitch up and over. Now there's one thing I wanted to point out. So I'm a big fan of learning how to read your knitting and figuring out cues that are in your fabric that could help assist you as you're working your stitch pattern. So in this repeating sequence, um, when you're working the first of those knit 2 stitches, and so those are the ones that are always following the slip 1, that first knit stitch is always done over the previous row's eyelet. So let me show you what I mean. So let's start a repeat. So that was first we got to do the yarn over, and then we're going to slip 1. Okay, so now we have those 2 knit stitches. So see how that first stitch that I'm going to knit is right above where the previous row's eyelet was. So that's just a little visual cue for myself to know that I'm on the right track. I always know that the first of those knit 2 stitches is always going to be over this eyelet. And if I don't see that it's over the eyelet, that means that maybe I messed up somewhere on the previous row. It's good to keep an eye on this because it helps you avoid working the entire row misaligned and then having to tink back the entire row. So instead, you can catch this potential mistake right away. So I'm going to go ahead and do my knit 2 now. And then I have my pass the slip stitch over. Then I'll do my yarn over, my slip 1. And again, I'm about to do the first of those knit 2s and see how this stitch that I'm about to knit is over the previous row, the previous row's eyelet. So I know that I am in the right area. Then I will do my pass the slip stitch over. Okay, so that's my last PSSO, and it said to repeat until the last 2 stitches. So we've made it, and then we just knit the last 2 stitches. Okay, so row 1 is now complete. I'm going to turn the work, and now we're ready to work row 2. So on row 2, which is a wrong side row, you're just going to be purling all the stitches to the end. But because I'm working a slip stitch edge, I first need to slip that first stitch. So again, holding the, because I'm on the wrong side, I'm going to be holding the yarn in the front of the right needle, and then I'm going to insert it into the first stitch purlwise, and then I'm just going to slip it. And then I'm going to give the yarn a bit of a tug, and then I will purl the next stitch. And same thing like I done on the other right side row. I want to make sure to work that next stitch after the slip stitch pretty tightly. So I'm going to purl it and then give another tug. And the other thing I wanted to point out, when you're working a slip stitch edge, especially in a linen yarn like this, it might look really loose as you're working it. You kind of need to work a bunch of rows in order for it to kind of see how it lines up. So don't be too concerned if on the row that you're actually working, it seems like it's a bit too loose, because it usually just seems to work itself out. So now I will just purl all of my stitches to the end. Okay, so I'm just about done with row 2. Okay, so I'll turn my work, and now I'm going to be ready to start row 3. On row 3, it's the same stitches as row 1, but the sequence is just slightly different. So let's go ahead and first slip our first stitch. So again, holding the yarn, because we're in a right side row, holding the yarn in the back, so behind the right needle. I'm going to insert the right needle into the first stitch purlwise, and then just slip it, and then give a bit of a tug. And then it says to knit 1. So I'm going to go ahead and knit that first stitch. And again, I'm going to kind of give it a nice tug since we're right next to that slip stitch. And then it says to slip 1. So we'll go ahead and do our slip 1. then knit 2, then the PSSO, the pass the slip stitch over. So insert the left needle into the 3rd stitch in, that was the slip stitch, and then lift it up and over those 2 stitches you just knit and off of the needle. And then it says to yarn over. So that's one thing I just wanted to point out. A big difference between row 1 and row 3 is that in row 1 you had started the sequence with a yarn over, but in row 3 it's actually at the end of the sequence. You'll then repeat the sequence that's inside the brackets over and over again until the last 3 stitches. The sequence starts with the slip 1, and then we're going to knit 2. And I just wanted to point out again, just like in row 1, the first of those 2 knit stitches that I need to knit, see how the first one, it's over the previous row's eyelet. You see that big hole that it's right over. So again, I know that everything is aligned properly when I see that. Okay, so there is my knit 2. Then I'm going to pass the slip stitch up and over, and then I work my yarn over. Okay, so then we will repeat it again. Slip 1, knit 2, and again that first of the knit 2 is right over the previous row's eyelet hole. Then I'll work my pass the slip stitch over. And actually this is a good example. So see how that stitch was splitty and not all of it made it? That's okay. All I'll do is I'll take the little strands that didn't quite make it and I'll lift those up and over. There we go. And then I will yarn over. So I'm just going to repeat that until 3 stitches before the end. Okay, so I'm just about at the end. I have my pass the slip stitch up and over, and then I end with my yarn over. So that's just an important thing I want to point out again, because the yarn over is at the end of the sequence. Make sure that at the end, when you get to those 3 stitches, that you remember to finish with the yarn over. And then you will just knit those last 3 stitches. And then you're done with row 3. And then you would just turn your work, and row 4 is just like the previous wrong side row. You'll slip that first stitch and then you'll just purl all the stitches to the end. So as you can see, these crossover stitches, so see these right here, these are when you pass the slip stitches over and they are staggered like this. So see how they're all kind of staggered because of how the sequence changed up on row 3. Now, one thing I wanted to communicate is that the good thing with this stitch pattern is that if you had a row that was messed up and it didn't stagger like this, if you don't feel comfortable with tinking back, then you could just move forward and it's not crazy noticeable. I wanted to show you what a mess up looked like just to prove this point. So here is, I'll move this over. So here is just a little mini swatch that I did where I intentionally messed up. And as you can see right in the center, there's an area where those crossovers they're not staggered. They're one on top of the other. It's right over here. But as you can see, in the grand scheme of things, it's really not that noticeable. So I just wanted to point this out just to give you a little confidence that if you at any point mess up one of your rows, it's not absolutely necessary to tink back. With this yarn in particular, a lot of linen yarns like this can be a little bit trickier to tink back on. So if this does happen to you and you don't feel like you want to have to deal with the tinking back, I personally feel this is a pretty livable mistake, and I can be pretty, I could be a pretty bad perfectionist, but this is really not that noticeable. So you could feel confident that if this happens to you, you could just keep moving forward. The important thing is that you do always have the same amount of stitches. So if, let's say, you had forgotten to work a yarn over somewhere along the line on the previous row, you can fudge things just by, adding in an extra yarn over on the next row, or, if somehow you wound up with extra stitches, you could also do a knit two together. Similarly, adding those sorts of things in this type of stitch pattern, it really will just get pretty lost. It's not going to be super noticeable. So just something I wanted to point out and to give you a little confidence in case something like that did happen. So that is how to work the Irish mesh stitch that's featured in my Cruel Summer cardigan.